absolute pleasure to moderate the panel session today, the panel on the promises and the problems of complex models in policy, and not only, but particularly thinking and imagining how this sits and fits with sustainability policy. And I'm just gonna read this from your program. You have prepared it, that's why you are here, but just in case you just ended up here. But the use of complex and data-driven models in government policy and implementation is growing rapidly. And thanks to increasingly powerful computational techniques and the growing availability of data, or the harvesting, well, it's not just available, it's actively being produced. These models are able to represent not just societal issues and developments, but also ecological systems with allegedly increasing accuracy. And they make it possible thereby to explore policy interventions, to predict what effects may be, and they can support or can claim to support decision-making with more scientific insights, particularly as they pertain to sustainability promises. But of course, we know that there's a big world and gap between the promises of this improved and better policy information and societal, democratic and political decision-making. There's a tension, and we want to explore in this panel the tensions, not in the least because we know that these models can change the practices of making and doing policy or imagining policy. Crucially also, who gets to influence that policy and whose data and knowledges matter and count in these complex systems. Because these models, even though they claim to represent societal and ecological systems, we know that they are not just neutral representations. They select some, leave out other things. And we know that they are based increasingly on normative choices, particularly assumptions that are not always open and available to the wider public, but even policymakers themselves. So in a democratic context, in fact, we would expect or suspect that these models can also be contested and opened up. So what we are trying to do in this panel is look at three particular things. Of course, what are the promises of these types of complex systems and modeling? And we're talking about algorithms in terms of large language modeling, deep learning modeling, models, but also modeling increasingly. And I already know that, for example, Eefje will talk a lot about modeling, and Jurriaan will talk more about algorithms. I'm introducing the speakers in a second. So what is the potential of these models, particularly for working and reworking scientific insights in terms of sustainability policies? What are the requirements and how can we cater for transparency, contestability and explainability of these models, but also what are their practical uses? Where have we seen that they have been put into place? Are they being questioned? Are they being contested? And if so, by whom? And we know that the speakers here today also play a role, not just in the rollout, but also in matters pertaining to public debate, contestability of these models. So those are the things that we would like to deal with today. Thank God I don't have to do that. I just have the honor of moderating our wonderful speakers today. So we have Eefje Cuppen here. She is the director of the Rathenau Institute, but she is also a professor in governance of sustainability at the Institute of Public Administration. I want to see, yeah, here at Leiden University in The Hague. And Eefje will especially address you and address these questions here today from her perspective as the director of Rathenau Institute. So the institute in the Netherlands that is formally tasked with stimulating and enabling public dialogue and political debates about science and innovation and technology. So she's talking from that perspective, but of course also from her perspective as an academic and a professor in this field, who is always critically looking at the use of models in policy and decision making. So very nice to have you with us, Eefje. And our second guest and speaker is Jurriaan Parie. He is the co-founder and the director for, I should say, algorithm. Audit, which is an NGO, and if I am correct, the first so far and the only European NGO. Yeah, but of course, I can imagine that you're seeking more solidarity also with other partners in Europe that are doing this. And it's a knowledge platform, and Jurriaan will also talk about the role, his role, and of the NGO in terms of the types of actors that are needed for assessing, advising and auditing, in this case particularly AI systems and AI values. And our third speaker, so this is how we'll progress in terms of order, is Alex Ingrams. He's an associate professor in open government and transparency, also at the Institute for Public Administration at University Leiden here in The Hague. And we already know that Alex is going to address all the big questions that no one else can address. But he's also giving his reflections on what theory and scientific state-of-the-art work can tell us about some of these questions. So the structure is as follows. The three speakers will give a short opening statement. And after each opening statement, there's the possibility, a few minutes, to ask some questions. Then we'll go on to the next speaker. And further ado, Eefje, may I give you the stage. Eefje Cuppen.
So you already said it, Jiska. Thank you very much for introducing me. So indeed, it's my role as director of the Rathenau Institute that I'm reflecting upon this topic, but also indeed my chair in governance of sustainability and a research program that we are running here at the university together with Delft University of Technology on the use of models in decision making on energy transition. But also a third role that I think is very relevant for the topic we are talking about today, which is I was part of the Dutch advisory team, the societal impact team that was installed, well, it was shortly after the peak of the pandemic in the Netherlands, to advise the government on the societal impacts of the pandemic. And that was because we had the outbreak management team, which based itself mostly on epidemiological data and models. And it was clear that a wider set of knowledges indeed was needed to advise the government about societal impacts. And I think that also is a very relevant source to draw upon in this. So I try to structure my opening statement. There are two perspectives that I would like to bring in here. So, and that's firstly the perspectives of the models themselves. And secondly, well, the use of the models in decision making. And I think on these two levels, there are things that we need to unpack in order to get more clear what we're talking about. Because indeed, models and data are very powerful and useful tools to support decision making on complex issues, especially related to sustainability, with highly complex and deeply uncertain problems. Think of climate change, have very long-term scenarios that need to be calculated or can be calculated with models. So it's very useful. But, of course, there is a but. The title of the panel was Between Promise and Problems. And I think promises are always very powerful. So my contribution here might be leaning a bit more towards the problems, but that is because these promises are so powerful. So in order to end up somewhere in the healthy middle, I think it's important to really point to these problems. So firstly about the models themselves, and I think here I'm not saying anything new, but it's important to just start with that. I think models are not neutral. Models are not value neutral. They always have values in them, and sometimes that is something that can be clearly seen, but sometimes these values are also hidden. And for instance, in my field, my research field of sustainability and climate, we see that the models that are being used to support, for instance, the planning of energy infrastructure, or the models also that are being used by the IPCC, they have a very strong techno-economic focus, a techno-economic worldview, you could say. So techno-economic values dominate in that. And that is, I think, important to know. There are all kinds of reasons why that is there, and there's also good reasons for that. But for instance, and then I link to the program that we're working on here at the university, Energy justice has come up over the past years as an important policy goal. So policymakers explicitly say, when we transform a neighborhood into a sustainable energy system, justice is one of the values that we want to safeguard. When the models are only focusing on techno-economic values, that limits the space of decision options that are in the end on the table. So models, and one of my PhD students did a review of models that are used in the energy system, for instance, and she concludes indeed that the majority of those models are on optimization and are very bad in taking these social issues into account, you could say. That also has to do with questions like who decides, so who builds the models? And who owns the models? So many of the models that are being used are privately owned. They're proprietary, they involve IP. And so it's very hard also to understand what the values in those models are. And this is, I would say, this is if you want to indeed use models to support decision making on, for instance, an energy infrastructure that is just, also socially just, fair, or include social values, this is problematic. And why is that? And that is because models are performative. They are not just neutral tools. They are, in a sense, always political. Even when they're not contested, they are political. Maybe, and they should be contested because they are political. They have power because they shape the, let's say, the decision options that are on the table. And that is important. And this is something that I think maybe modelers not always realize, and also policymakers do not often realize. So it's something like, yeah, well, this is what science tells us, or this is what the numbers tell us. But there is a whole, implicit set of assumptions and choices before that, makes that these numbers or figures or outcomes are on the table. So it's important to open that up. And here I think this also has to do with, so the use of models in decision making. And here, this experience of the societal impact team that I was in, I found that very striking to be part of that, because we were struggling all the time with the question, the outbreak management team, I don't know how that was in other countries, but they used the R value to just track how the pandemic was evolving. One number, it's so easy. It goes up, it goes down. And so it's so easy to steer on that one value. But it's not a useful number, not a useful indicator if you want to steer on, let's say, the impacts of the pandemic on specific groups, like youngsters here in this classroom. Well, they were not in this classroom, or elderly people, or whatever. So there were all kinds of specific groups that were missed out, and the impacts of the pandemic and the measures of the pandemic on those groups. So how do you mobilize these different types of knowledge, and how do you, let's say, combat or compete with this one number? And then you see that there is such a strong preference by policymakers and politicians for quantitative information. So quantitative information is just more powerful than qualitative information. And this also has to do with the way we have institutionalized expertise, I would say. And then here, and I think, well, you both, I guess you will say something about it, but I think here, this was mainly about models, making a small step to the dependence, also because the question for the panel was about also what can governments do. I think here, governments, what is clear, increasingly depend on just a few American big tech companies. And I think we are now running at the Rathenau Institute, we are running a project on digital dependence. We started that already a while ago. When we started it, we really had to put this on the agenda. And now you see this topic of digital sovereignty, digital autonomy, well, it's everywhere. And the awareness for that is already very high. But it comes with a lot of consequences. And it has repercussions, I think, in all kinds of ways and in all kinds of domains. So let me come to my the question, so what's next? Huh? Or what should we then do? So firstly about the models. I think transparency, that's also, I think Alex will say more about that too. Transparency is very important. So to what extent are modelers already being transparent about the algorithms and the assumptions and the data that they use? And that's important, to be transparent about that. But it's not enough, I would say. It's also important to, especially if you say that models should support, let's say, just, well, for instance, energy transition, if social values are part of the policy goals, it's important to include other values and worldviews, because these models are so powerful and performative. And this is what we are trying to do in the project that I'm in here at the university. We are trying to work with modelers to build social values in their models. So we are trying to build energy system models that also include values like fairness. But even that is not enough, because of course a model will not solve everything. Well, that would be nice, but it's also the process of modeling that is very important. So who gets to decide what the model is about? Who gets to decide what questions are at all on the table? Because a model is of course always a representation of a problem. So there is a problem definition, and who defines that problem? That is a key question. So can we build models in more participatory ways? That's what we are trying to do. So involving stakeholders in the development of models. And then about the decision making. I think a first question, if we think about models and digitization, and this has to do with the promise, between promise and problems, there is also a big hype around digital tools. And I think a first question is, well, use it in a responsible way. So do we really need it? Do we need a digital tool for this specific problem? Sometimes the answer may be no. Sometimes it's just better to do it in very old-fashioned ways, not using any digital tools, and you can avoid many of the problems. So this techno fix, or the hype, I think is something that needs to be avoided. And then if we think about the role of governments, I think also here it is important to see governments also in their different roles. And I think governments, they are being seen a lot in their role as regulator. But of course, governments are also a very important actor in using all these models and tools and support systems. And they have a lot of power by setting the purchasing conditions. So they have purchasing power. And I think governments can use that more. And lastly, I think zooming out a bit, in the end, this is a question about, how can we come to better decisions by using knowledge? That's what this is all about, data, models, algorithms. And especially when we talk about sustainability, these problems or these challenges, they inherently involve many different values, perspectives on what the problem exactly is, how it should be solved. These are wicked or unstructured problems. It's the government's responsibility to include and weigh these different perspectives and values, and to safeguard public values also in designing public policies. And how can governments do that? How can governments safeguard public values when producing and using knowledge for decision making? And I would say this is not only a question for the tools or the models that are being used by governments, but it should be viewed as a broader governance question that we would, and we were just talking about it, at Rathenau we talk about the democratization of knowledge. And that refers to the strengthening of the knowledge ecosystem, you could say. And that involves not only the domains of experts or the technology developers or the modelers, people who build the models, and also not only the domain of governments, of administration and politics, but also the domain of civil society, markets, law and regulation, citizens, users of technologies and data. And I think improving the role of knowledge requires in decision-making, improving the role of knowledge in decision-making requires competencies and capacities of actors in all these different domains. And I think this is also something, when zooming out, that governments can steer more on. So I already talked about purchasing power, but it can also steer by investing in civil society groups. It can also steer by stimulating the use of other types of knowledge, for instance, by installing a societal impact team next to the outbreak management team in the pandemic. It can also stimulate the build-up of more qualitative or social science or humanities types of knowledge for decision making next to these more quantitative information. So let's not forget that decision making on these issues is taking place in many other domains than government as well. So we have to look there too. And with this, I took way too long, I think, but I hope, anyways. Thank you.
Thank you, Eefje. So, Eefje, thank you very much, and you underscore once more these values in models. And also problematizing this suggestion that these models are offered to those making policy and that there's sort of a natural ease with which these worldviews can be used, whilst you do state that policymakers love the R number, right? This one quantitative imagination of what to steer on and what to govern. I want to open up the floor for some short, clarifying or curious questions to Eefje.
I had a question for you about the role of pragmatism, especially in the creation of these models. Because one thing I've noticed, I'm a qualitative researcher who's become mixed methods for the purpose of my PhD. I'm now doing a quantitative study, and I've been surprised at how many choices are made for purely, quote unquote, pragmatic reasons, where we're using data that is really not up to snuff in a lot of ways to create a very simple model. I'm being told that I should make certain assumptions because we simply don't have data to do this in more depth, and that's been, I think, a bit of a surprise at how I've been coached to handle this from a more, quantitative, we're making a model that can produce a number perspective. So rather than it even being about values, obviously values are a big part of the issue there as well. What is important to study and what's not. What's been coming up even more is this sort of pragmatic approach to the data, and rather than acknowledging the complexity, it's how can we simplify and how can we do this the fastest or the easiest way possible.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I think this is also the nice thing of stepping into a different world and seeing then indeed the difference between also the rationalities or the paradigms or whatever. And I do recognize what you say. And I think, we had it reminds me of another discussion we had recently, where indeed, I think, so if you think about it more like an interdisciplinary problem, where there are people who are more from the quantitative side, maybe more from the natural sciences, they tend to think in solutions. I'm also, partly trained as an engineer, and I also noticed, for instance, when moving to the Institute of Public Administration, I felt more like an engineer. I thought, oh yeah, I have this problem, the solution-oriented mindset, I have that in me. Well, while being in an engineering environment, I feel like the social scientist who is always problematizing everything. So it's really interesting. And I think both of them are needed. And I think there is work for the, let's say, the quantitative people to be more reflective, because also pragmatism is, you could say, it is based on values. That's also an efficiency choice you make. And it has to do, I think, with but it needs to result in a clear solution. So, so it's good to be a bit more reflexive, I would say. But then on the other hand, I think many social scientists, humanities, people are very good at problematizing and asking questions and critically reflecting. But there maybe the solution orientation might sometimes help also to, okay, but then what does it mean for? And what should we then do or change? So I think this is really, on both sides, I think there is, in that sense, maybe something to learn. So it's really interesting that you are making this transition, actually.
Well, easier to ask it. Hopefully we can take it further in the discussion, because I can agree with 100% of this need to bring closer the social sciences and the engineers. And I take the main message of your short pitch to be the non-neutrality of technology. We need to come to grips with this lesson from philosophy of technology. Basically, I remember these discussions 10 years ago about different technologies, but it seems that we are fighting an uphill battle to uproot, let's say, the strong tendency for all of us to be instrumental about technology. And we need to come to grips with this insight from STS, from philosophy of technology, so that we can open the box of discussions between social scientists and engineers. And I really appreciated the last part in particular of your pitch, in which you pleaded for the involvement of civil society, of democratization of technology, because we need to get out of our let's say, ivory tower of engineers and social scientists and involve the broader society. So it's not just the projects that we are good at doing at our institutes, but we involve the broader society. And what I would like to ask you, if at TNO you have also strategy to involve the education system, particularly at a younger age, so that we teach the new generations the lesson of the non-neutrality of technology, so we don't have to redo the whole work again. So the children as well are becoming aware of the technologies around them, shaping their views, their decisions as well, and then become part of the conversation when they reach, let's say, the stages of being professionals and engaging in the projects that we are all contributing to. So besides civil society, do we have a strategy as well to go to high schools, for instance, to talk to high school children, perhaps even younger, and tell them about the projects that we are developing?
I fully agree, and I think it's important not only youngsters, but because you could also say, why focus on youngsters? I also get a bit itchy when people say we need to start in schools for two reasons, because for me it feels a bit, I hear policymakers saying that this a lot, and we need to involve future generations. For two reasons I get a bit itchy, because firstly, it sounds a bit like, well, problem of the next generation. Well, I think there are people in power now. They need to do things. So I think, and there's a lot missing and going wrong there. So why not empower the people who are now on the seats to actually act? And the second is also that I think, oh, these poor school teachers, they just have to take up more and more issues that we as society think is important. So I'm a bit, yeah. So of course, I mean, it sounds good, but I mean, it's not the only group I would say we need to focus on. Still, I think it is very important. And for instance, at Rathenau, we also do this. So we have now a dialogue program running for 5 years on the digital society, where we engage in all kinds of different ways, large groups, big groups, different groups in society. We engage with people in the question, well, what is the digital future you would want to live in, to turn it around? So rather than seeing this digital transition as something that is, oh, and how can we navigate and steer, but just really think how would we want it to be? And there we also talk with kids in schools, for instance, how they use, so we had sessions where we talked with kids about how they use their smartphones, for instance, in social relations. And also that is a way to, so we use the term technological citizenship, for instance, for that. It's a way, so we developed a method that people in schools can use to talk with kids without using difficult words like technological citizenship, but to make them indeed aware of these things. Yeah. I can point you to that if you are interested in that, because it's a method I think that others can use too. It's very easy.
Thank you. Hey, and in terms of the hypes, Eefje, that you are talking about, some of the promises of the techno fix, and I now want to ask Jurriaan, because in your work you are not only trying to hold these models to account, but also thereby contest and challenge some of the assumptions and the promises that are made. So I want to give Jurriaan Parie, the director of Algorithm Audit, the floor.
Thank you so much, and great to be here. I will start with rather a more personal introduction where it comes from. I co-founded an NGO together with an ethicist in philosophy background. I myself have more a background in mathematics and statistics, so I did an awful lot of mathematical modeling myself. Dropped out of a PhD in Zurich, very, very, very technical university, very techno-fix focused during the pandemic, where this was like entirely based on like COVID modeling, and I did an awful lot of Bayesian hierarchical modeling. Dropped out, quit with it, so I know quite what kind of normative decisions you can take with that respect. I then kind of ended up in finance regulation, which is interesting because it gets to regulating transaction monitoring models. Like huge different discipline, finance, there's so much numbers, so much algorithms needed to kind of get a grasp of what's going around there. And as well, those models should be validated by market parties who are then kind of auditing or validating those models for financial institutions like banks in the Netherlands. What I found fascinating there is that I just started questions. Why is this threshold for like withdrawing cash deposits on an annual basis set to 10k euros? Just why? Why 10k? There was no answer in this entire kind of due diligence process. We asked the bank up and down like a couple of times. There was no answer. It turned out to be like a decision rule somewhere defined in a business meeting. There were no notes. It was just a bunch of people together saying, no, okay, it's 10k. So that's kind of where my fascination comes from. How does this modeling work? Who's asking kind of the why questions? How can it be motivated and be done more rigorously if you decide to do so than an algorithm or such a model is a good thing in the first place? So that brought me as well by dropping out kind of industry, more from this consulting perspective, because those consultants, they think, okay, just get the job done, we got paid, and it's a difficult question, but it's not up to us to answer the question. We draft a report. That report is sent to the European regulator, the European Central Bank in this perspective, and it's up to the regulator to ask the difficult questions about the 10k and why it has been the 10k and whether it was well motivated or not, how we like validated that threshold. So, and that's what you see and fascinates me, how this can be regulated in a wider setting, not only in finance, also in public sector. Usage of AI models, algorithms in sustainability, in all different fields, models there are in this more increasingly data-driven society. So then we started with this NGO doing primarily public sector work and ended up digging deep in a freedom of information request of journalists. So this has a very important factor in balancing kind of the state powers, where you have a huge branch of government, the executive part, who has many means and like a lot of budget to develop and test and pilot all different kind of models, algorithms, models, AI systems, etc. But the controlling state power, kind of parliament, the judiciary, the courts, the competent authorities, have much less cloud at the moment to control effectively the executive part that is developing rapidly in this digital sphere. So that's where we kind of hope and contribute from an NGO perspective by doing primarily case-based work, by informing more the controlling powers within the state. Hey, how can you regulate your own state in the first place? And then secondly, as well, the private sector. So we kind of started with a freedom of information request, digged deep and start asking questions about why making differentiation, why profiling citizens based on, which was kind of in this pilot phase of machine learning, exploiting higher or like multidimensional correlation patterns and finding the patterns we can't see with our human eye. Oh, machine learning, very promising method. And we just put our entire kind of database, we have all our citizens in Rotterdam in this cocktail. And out of those 80 variables, we find those patterns that there is like, oh, we couldn't think about it on forehand. So we just ask questions, why this one up to 80, even considering it, whether like people are having mental issues, why should that be part of a machine learning algorithm? Can't you just decide to exclude it on forehand because it's already very, very, very tricky under the GDPR? It's even like prohibited. Why in a pilot is it possible that this could be considered in the first place? And then you kind of encounter that there are not that many protocols or best practices available at that specific kind of variable and characteristic selection level that prescribes for those governmental agencies that are in the executive part what should be in or out, and that these internal control mechanisms with respect to GDPR, for instance, not always work properly, and that there is a lot of room then to innovate and kind of try new things, even if that's like unlawful. So then we ended up doing not kind of the unsolicited, digging deep in the freedom of information request case, but we were asked by a huge Dutch public sector organization in the executive part of the education system. They are providing like all students in the Netherlands with a grant, and they lived like, they are not living at their parents, but they live in student housing to get a certain grant, but there were like fraud with these grants and as well control procedures to knock on the door of a student and saying, hey, who is living here? And it's supposed that Jurriaan is living here, but where's Jurriaan? Can we see, you can reject that people really get inspect your house. But there was like huge media attention to it. Journalists, again, raised the concern, hey, there's a huge overrepresentation we suspect for students with a migration background that has been controlled, and like students with Dutch origin were underrepresented. That should be kind of traced back to whether that could be rejected or accepted, that claim. So we interacted a lot then under high political and like the top of the ministry, like that is like speaking on behalf of the government to see how we can like work with those people to really investigate what was going on. That realized for us that especially when it gets to then bias in algorithmic driven decision making, so not really the algorithm is biased, but this entire human machine interaction process that all contributes to kind of the formal decision that the governmental actor is playing, this entire like multi-step approach. There's this very fuzzy thing about bias. Bias is often like obfuscating the discussion. When it gets more like legal, it gets about discrimination. You have like all legal frameworks for that. EU non-discrimination law at different levels, national, Europe, and as well like the Council of Europe with the Treaty of Human Rights. The only way we think now is to get really those policy makers to move when taking it seriously to, for instance, investigate indirect discrimination. So you're not differentiating directly on a criteria like ethnicity or race, but like indirectly through proxy characteristics, that's called. So for instance, zip code or literacy rate or even like many variables. You do not really think about obvious proxy candidates do have a certain effect, because from statistical modeling we know, like by definition, if it's not like two dices, there is a correlation between variables. So there will always be a certain correlation. So there will always be a certain proxy characteristics related to a protected ground. So even like the distance you live away from your parents at the population level turns out to be a proxy aspect in differentiating upon people. So it's a really fuzzy, difficult concept, this indirect discrimination, that has huge effects. We only kind of realized recently after these investigations, and the only way to make it very concrete and point it down to policymakers, hey, there's a problem here, is by doing statistics and putting a number on it. So we could argue, based on like population statistics of the National Office of Statistics, the probability that a student with a non-European migration background is selected for a house inspection by a social inspector is 3.6% or times higher than a student with Dutch origin. When you put such a very concrete number on that phenomena, all policymakers kind of to the top, even the minister, they apologize for it. But when it gets to kind of more this qualitative assessment, yeah, you should weigh it in its context, and it's always context dependent, and there are pros and cons, and that's just kind of a blueprint for considering and doing everything that even is considered, and they're not really rigid and prescribed protocols for assessing it in a careful manner when you're deploying such quite heavy weighing methods for profiling people. So that's kind of reflecting upon the models. There are like multiple models, very context-dependent models. Specifically when it gets to high impact domains, it could be beneficial as well in this government sector. That's what we are kind of now advocating for. Don't do it only based on those very broad and horizontal soft law frameworks there are out there. Many of those frameworks and as well standards, for instance, now developed under the European AI Act, they are very horizontal, not technology specific. So it's the same risk management process for deep learning, face detection, machine learning based risk profiling, while in the core, in the modeling perspective, it's a totally different cup of tea, whether you're like training a deep learning model or you are going for a rule-based human input is processed in the data modeling phase as well. It requests and asks for its own instructions how those models should be developed. So it more asks for vertical standards, more technology specific standards, rather than this more approach of soft law frameworks currently, more horizontal. So that is kind of what we are now working on, specifically with this big question in the Netherlands, that there's this track record with scandals and huge compensation programs. Like the Dutch state has to like kind of reimburse over 60 million to disadvantaged students. There were like over 10,000 disadvantaged and discriminated students over the last 10 years. There's so much money spent on kind of reactive compensation rather than proactive prevention of these. And that all comes down, we think, with more this open mindset of working together and picking up initiatives more bottom-up rather than only relying on top-down frameworks. So we've been waiting for a long time on Europe with the AI Act. Now the AI system definition turns out to be very thin. There's more room for national legislation. How should this legislation look like? We say, look at kind of all bottom-up initiatives, they are there. Informing as well supervisory authorities, as the example I started with the ECB, they can start asking very critical questions as well. So I think the way forward, especially to discriminatory public sector algorithms, is that we can create more hard law. We should be critical on soft law and how we approach it. And we can have a much stronger appeal on institutional protection of these fundamental rights. And that there's really a challenge to get those institutions more up and running. I can elaborate a little bit more on that later, but won't take you for much longer for now. I think that's a quick intro in the work we are doing.
Thanks, Jurriaan. Yeah. Already, I think at least between Eefje and Jurriaan, once more, it strikes me that how this quantified thinking seems to be the sort of the dominant and only way in which policymakers can think or respond. That's of course too simplified, but that only the case to be made in terms of that these algorithms are discriminatory is only when you can translate it into the likelihood of being picked out for a check, right? So 3.6 higher, and that it's difficult to make the qualitative argument well, against discrimination. And also you point out, Jurriaan, the costs, right, in terms of the promises of these systems, even just the compensation scheme. So you talk about DUO, but also think in terms of the toeslagenaffaire in the Netherlands, right? So the cost that the state has to make in compensating the use of these particular kinds of models, and that's also the point you make. It's not the models that are doing the discriminatory work, it's the interaction between humans, policymakers, model makers, and these models. A few short questions to Jurriaan. For example, in terms of the work that he does on the algo prudence. Looking at Margot, our expert on this.
I was thinking about, because you said, one of the last things you said was we need more hard laws instead of soft laws. And I'm maybe a bit skeptical. I wonder, I mean, I feel like people will always find a way around these hard laws and find sort of a loophole or whatever to do whatever they want. So I'm not against it, but I still feel like it should be sort of and hard laws and soft laws and sort of the whole package. So it's more of a thought than a question, maybe.
Agree. I can elaborate a little bit more on that. Is that when you dig down more deeper in like the hierarchical order of non-discrimination law in Europe, you have the convention at the European Council level, and then you have like national implementation through the constitution, but as well through equal treatment directive in the Netherlands, where you have like formulated that not all ways of differentiation are directly discriminating, but it can be like objectively justified. and that it all gets to like very openly formulated norms, which we find too difficult now to be filled in practice, and that there's especially supervisory authorities are lagging in providing an explanation how this specific open legal norm should be interpreted in the context of like one-sided governmental action. And even if you can go up to the Convention of Human Rights, it's a very careful path you have to consider, and there has to be too much leeway for governmental actors to go in that space and step with big shoes over very careful defined boundaries. So there we think it's not like as well in the red taping discussion, it's more red taping or more rules. These are already rules and they have been like violated many times. We just have to prescribe more carefully in law, and there's like a fine attached to it that it's absolutely prohibited, and you can go much more detailed in your due diligence and how do you call it, like you have this principle of care and of informing your decision very well. Those like principles of sound governance as well, like codified in this Dutch national public sector. It's all there, but it's very openly formulated. So we just want to prescribe that more to prevent these like huge scale fundamental rights violations in the future.
Just really very high level question about this quantification, quantitative information. Well, first of all, what I was thinking is what you cannot govern what you cannot measure. So there's that saying. So I would want to see really what you think about that. And the other thing is, aren't we dealing something that's fundamentally quantitative? Yes, there are qualitative conversations that you can have about it in society, but it's about data, models, processing. It's quantification of the world, representation of the world in quantities, basically, that we are trying to deal. And so there is like some fundamental issue, basically, about thinking qualitatively around something quite quantitative. And also thinking about the demand about standardization. Isn't that, again, a quantification demand? When we are asking to standardize things, then aren't we talking about some sort of quantification again? Just very general, high-level question.
Thanks. Quick answer then, because we can, I think, talk about this for a long time. Ever since the Enlightenment, you can say there has been this collision of the world of numbers and the world of words and how they could be like live together. It's really one of the key topics in like longer, wider historical debates. Very difficult one. I think just it brought us a lot, this world of numbers. In terms of like public, all those domains, yeah, you have all those facts. Full Fact is a book like full with how well the world in certain aspects is doing. But the existing way of like giving thoughts about fairness and justice is primarily legal, and it's oriented about words, more qualitative. There has been like input from the quantitative domain, but it's always a qualitative judgment that needs to be made, and that I think relates to your point of those standards. That's kind of a promise of those standardization. It's not only quantitative, it's also for more risk management perspective. It's also like identifying what is the residual risk when certain measures are taken, and do we consider this residual risk acceptable or not? And that's ultimately, again, kind of a qualitative judgment. We see it with aviation, like it's kind of under scrutiny over the last years. There are some accidents and there have been many safety protocols, and many quantitative inputs that it's very safe, but now as well very qualitative realizations that the residual risk is maybe not that small as we thought it to be. So I think especially standardization offers an interesting risk management perspective of like mitigating the risk which are inherently to technology.
So Eefje, you already pointed out some important avenues to explore and consider, right? Moving away from the data fix, more participatory decision making, challenging and contesting the alleged neutrality, right, of the values in technology. Jurriaan is not calling for more regulation, but for better encoding and prescription of these rules in law and following them up. To sort of close the conversation, Alex, I want to give you the floor to also explore further what current academic literature is teaching and telling us about these calls for transparency and responsibility and accountability. So Alex Ingrams, please take to the floor.
Thank you very much, and thanks to the fascinating comments that have already come before me. It's a tough act to follow, but this will, if you like, be a call for more research. And so it's a way to round up and think about how we can turn some insights from transparency research into something actionable and something that policymakers can leverage. I'm glad that Jurriaan mentioned the Enlightenment, because I'm not going to. I'm not going to remotely go there. But I do want to also echo what Eefje said, which is that transparency is not enough. And I think that's a key message that I want to bring in when we look at the research that we need to keep doing in this area. So we have, I won't put any sort of concrete historical observations on this, but we have been using data-driven models for a very long time, perhaps centuries, perhaps going back to the time in the Enlightenment. And these have increased in complexity as our technologies have evolved. And at certain points in history, there comes a time when there have been, because of the increase in the data processing capacity of technologies has increased so much that societal shifts are necessary to process such data. And those are transformative moments, and I think we're living in one of those transformative moments, specifically because of the way that data-driven models now have are trained to automatically self-learn and to produce outputs that can imitate human types of creativity and human types of insights. And it's that evolution in those technologies, which you could label as AI, if you like, that has made this such a transformative moment, and the reason why we need new ways of thinking about information sharing and transparency. So I want to present three important things that we've learned from the study of transparency. And these insights are not specific to the latest kinds of complex modeling or artificial intelligence, but they're general things that we've learned about transparency and the importance of how we share information and how effective transparency can be. And then I want to argue for three challenges that we face as researchers when thinking about how to make those ideas about transparency actually leverageable for policymakers. So the first thing that we've learned is about the relationship between transparency and complexity. We know from research now that while transparency is a useful mechanism to have in organizations, when data is extremely complex and the information can't be easily comprehended or digested, especially when you're dealing with non-expert types of audiences, transparency, it doesn't help in that context. So this sort of echoes Eefje's point that transparency is not enough in all these contexts, and we might want to explore these different ways, whether it's participation or legislative types of alternatives. Transparency is necessary, but it's not enough on its own. The second important thing that I think we've learned is the importance of reason giving. Giving reasons for the way that your models work. So this is different from explainability, which can involve very dense levels of interpretation and explanation of how models work. This is more about reason giving, the types of easily digestible, understandable reasons that you might give to a non-expert, a friend, a family member, about why, for example, a controversial algorithm didn't work. The third insight from research is that there are different kinds of transparency users. So there's been, both Eefje and Jurriaan have given some really insightful examples about, for example, in the Jurriaan's exploration of the education algorithm that was allocating funding for students based on a range of background data about those individuals. The type of information that you might give to a student would be different from an engineer who knew how to actually run those types of algorithms. And yet, how do you actually make those different types of information available to the right types of people? Right? Whereas arguably, you know, both the tech experts and the students themselves are essential audiences in such cases. So just to recap, so the relationship between transparency and complexity. Some things are too complex, transparency doesn't work. Second, the importance of reason giving. Thirdly, that there are different kinds of transparency users and how they perceive information and understand transparency is different. So what three challenges do we face as researchers? So firstly, deciding when some types of complexity might be to such a degree that transparency won't work. There might be cases, you know, if we look again, sorry to pick on Jurriaan, but for the example of the education algorithm, for example, is it possibly too complex? Is the way that the data has been used and the certain weights that they've had to make these subjective judgments on how they are factored into the final output, is that too complex to such a degree that it has to be radically scaled back or just not used at all? You know, in a case where transparency wouldn't work. I think a second important area of research is how do we create an ethos of responsibility in collaboration with model developers and companies. I use the word ethos as a rather summative term for the types of behavioral incentives that have already been discussed. So, you know, including participation of stakeholders, providing more legal mandates for things that they have to cover. But I think, and I agree somewhat with Margot's point, you know, these things have to be part of a bigger package, and I'd like to call that an ethos of responsibility. So how do we create that ethos of responsibility, particularly among companies that don't want to comply? You know, they care about their bottom line. The bottom line drives this techno-rational way of thinking about algorithms, so they're not really interested in embracing a broader set of public values. But why not? And how do we incentivize their greater sense of responsibility? Does there need to be a sort of a better code for developers, for example? A code of action in the same way that we apply for, say, doctors and lawyers. The third area I think we need to focus on is how we link these different transparency users in the ecosystem of model building. Okay, so how we link these transparency users in the ecosystem of model building. And you know, here I want to connect it to quite a concrete sustainability example. So we now have very elaborate models for prediction of environmental catastrophes, you know, floods, fires perhaps, or perhaps more slow-moving types of disasters like environmental degradation. And we also are aware that these both involve important models that have been developed by engineers, but they also involve learning from data which has inbuilt types of historical biases about the communities they might affect. And we know that more vulnerable communities tend to be disproportionately negatively affected by these types of tools because of their historical biases those data. So how can we think about, you know, who are the important transparency users? What types of information, account giving and reason giving do they need in those types of situations? As I think another really important area that we need to do more research on. And with that, I'll finish there.
Thank you, Alex.
Hi, I'm fairly new to science because I've been working as a consultant in the public sector. And what I'm puzzling hearing both Jurriaan and Alex's presentations is kind of what you see the Dutch government is doing on transparency issues is, for example, the transparency law, the VO. And you see this reflects to just open up everything and just open up all the information, basically. And then what you see in response is that's way too much information. It's not thought of what the users are, I should say, the transparency users. And also policy officials say, yeah, we just have to open up everything, but it's really not the relevant information at all. So that kind of puzzles me still, maybe because I'm new in the science world, but how do you see that also with Jurriaan, your call for more hard law, for example? Because in here I see the tension between this whole drive into we need to regulate, but also not really well thought through, I think, maybe. It's not a specific question. I'm wondering in this part, and I see you not, so you can work with this.
I'm nodding. I'm nodding because I have the exact. I've had the same sense about some of the inherent tensions that you see in various types of policy approaches to regulating algorithms or AI, and so I do think what you see often with these types of efforts to make more information about algorithms public or release the data and so forth, I think you often see a collision of different layers of policy initiatives, and they're all many of them are trying to do different things, and then it often doesn't really work as you expect it might. So if you do, for example, and I'll be talking a little bit later on in a panel about the algorithm register in the Netherlands, and there's a ton of data in there. Not very much of it is remotely useful to the average person. There is some quite technical data in there, which is also limited. You know, if the goal is for tech experts to kind of see what's happening and perhaps provide some criticism. So I think that type of tool is a very concrete example, is an area where different conceptualizations of transparency have sort of clashed. And yeah, and then of course there are all these other political incentives for organizations to be involved to show that they're being more transparent, more open and so forth. So you get it being driven by those types of other political strategies which are always there. But the ultimate goal, if it is to try and make algorithms work better, is not necessarily being served at the end of the day.
Super interesting. I'm not sure who this is addressed to, but let me pick up on one of the first points made by Eefje about all of these models being political in nature, right? You can't avoid some decision making. And then related to the observation that since we've been much more openly reflecting on these kind of political decisions and the negative effects of these models, particularly in the recent years, due to these scandals, due to just getting a certain sense also as the wider public of what these models can do through how we see ChatGPT work, for instance. And that makes that all kinds of models that have been in use for decades are now suddenly kind of suspicious, right? So we now go back to looking at models through a lens of, okay, what kind of hidden decisions are in this, and how does that affect the outcomes? At the same time, for a lot of these big organizations that have to process millions and millions of transactions, lots of these simpler models are just, you can't avoid them, right? This simpler decision trees when processing 18 million tax returns. Yeah, that's something you have to do and can't really do away with manually. So the question is then, how do we demarcate basically between when models are just part of operational processes and not really contentious, and at what point do we start thinking about these models as something that should be contestable, meet certain transparency standards, and how do we, so where do we draw the boundary basically, also practically, and how far back do we go in looking at the simpler quote unquote, because they can also be super complex, huge information databases that are being used, that we've always used, and maybe for the wrong reasons found unproblematic so far.
Really, really good question. So I think this connects somewhat to the issues, decisions that need to be made, you know, in the AI Act as well. You know, about is this high risk? I can't remember what the exact name of the different levels of risk are, but yeah, which you decide for yourself. It's a self-reporting mechanism with very serious consequences potentially if you get it wrong. So I think those types of incentives can drive careful thinking about, you know, what category does this apply to? But I think more importantly, my answer to this question is not so much about what criteria do we use to decide between those, because we can decide those, but if we want them to actually work, we actually need an ethos, if you like, to come back to my idea, where sort of honest reporting and regular review and assessment of what we're doing happens on a more regular basis. And then the finer details about how you define this, whether it's in or out, that sort of comes second. What matters is that you actually have a process and a set of institutions that behave independently and can do it in a way that you might trust and find legitimate.
A quick reflection as well on that question. So I think especially for governmental actors, all algorithmic systems are embedded in decision-making processes that are already regulated under this national public administration law. There are kind of obligations along with those principles who have been around for a long time. You can translate that back to very practical takeaways. For instance, machine learning algorithms for risk prediction obfuscate that much the kind of point you're making about giving reasons why certain decisions are made that you should not consider it in the first place. Then there are all those arguments about, no, we have explainable machine learning, like this algorithm in Amsterdam. How explainable was it? Not explainable. It was still kind of a Gini index-based kind of feature importance plot, you know? Not like, you have been selected for this control because in like 379 of the 468 random forest trees we trained, it turned out that your age was the most predicted. No, that's like in this already power relation between the state and the citizen, that is like just too much to explain that you were there in like, so it's kind of too much statistics on top of already this power balance. I think then, but institutions are kind of lagging behind and failing in protecting this more protection of existing rights by explaining how those norms, open norms in existing legal framework should be translated in this more digital practice and algorithmic practice. So we are more worried, and that's why we kind of organized more a civil society organization. Maybe institutions are not that well functioning at the moment to get their head around regulating well AI and algorithmic systems, because a lot can be said about the AI Act as well. That's a really bad law and not going in the right direction.
Yeah, I think it's a question for all three of you. Throughout my PhD, I've thought a lot about like transparency and communicating and all the things that come up now. But in the end, I think it still comes down to power. Who has the power? And I wonder, what are your ideas about how, as a citizen or a vulnerable citizen, you can take back that power and make sure that you can contest, that people have to explain how these models work? I mean, I feel like there are a lot of actors with a lot of knowledge about these systems who can all go around the laws, the soft laws, the hard laws. So how, as a citizen, can you sort of deal with that and take maybe a little bit of power back?
Very good question, I think. So, and this is what I think, what I tried to say a bit with my last point about zooming out, because this is not only something that governments are responsible for, but indeed, and so I'm really happy that you're here, and it's very nice also to hear how you have developed your work, and I also appreciate to hear how you started with this with your own investigations based on the what is it, the WO is it, I think. And then you were asked, so that's a good sign, I think. So, and I think this is something. So I think in all these different domains, like civil society, but indeed also individual users, we all need to become aware that we have power. In a sense, maybe we don't have as much power as we would like to, but then indeed, I mean, I agree, it is a question of power, and in that sense, also maybe relating to Bram's question, also I was thinking about the whole, I mean, we once thought that China was our problem when it came to our data and etc. But now suddenly the US is a problem. So it's also a moving target in a sense. So and which now, so I talked about this report that we are writing on digital dependence. When we started it, it was really something that was, we thought it was important to put it on the agenda, but there was not much audience for a story like that. And now it's everywhere. And because it is clear that it is an issue of power, indeed. So I don't have an answer to your question, what can we do? But I think realizing this and moments like this, so it's critical events like Trump becoming the president of the US, it has changed so much. So indeed, you talked about transformative phases, or what? So I think this is also part of that. So it's both AI and the whole geopolitical setting that has changed completely, which makes us also rethink how we have organized all this. And I think so. I really appreciate this whole discussion about digital sovereignty, and because it also shows the difficulty. If we really think we want to regain some of that power, probably it means we have to go through a phase first where we give in a lot of the things that we have to give up. Sorry, like the comfort and the ease of use of all the services that we are used to. So it involves pain too. But now it becomes clear that that is at least the decision that can be made, should be made, can be made. Yeah. So not a very clear answer, but.
Maybe as well, what you can do as a citizen to take back control or some power. You hear so much talking about these topics, but so less entrepreneurial spirit to build better tech in Europe. And it's really worrisome that, it's like the continent of talking and reflecting on, oh, yes, no, this power struggle. They are building it. We don't. Go build it.
I really want to thank the three of you. In combination with the questions and the comments you gave, and I think I know Bram would have loved insights, definitive answers. We have more questions, not just because we are also humanities or interested in the humanities, but I think this is so important, right? To ask not just more general questions, but ask questions about who's call to action, right? And who needs to step up. And something, for example, that I would have also loved to discuss is, who are we asking to be accountable and answerable? Is that the technology? Is that big tech? Or most crucially, the states that are making these decisions, right? And that need to be legitimize their monopoly on power in our society, right? So how these things connect with each other. But let's continue this thinking and the dialogue after this morning. Thank you so much and have a wonderful remainder of your conference. Thank you.